try to find a future. New pair of shoes are on my feet. Fashion is my only culture. Nothing ever changed. Oh no, nothing ever changed.
Hello, everybody. This is Essential Salts, and I'm here with Kentucky Matt. And he's joining me for a little series of reviews that I'm going to be doing on my channel, or that we'll be doing together, of Adam Curtis's new documentary, Can't Get You Out of My Head, which is fresh off the presses, just came out in 2021, and comes up pretty much almost right to the moment that we're at. I mean, even in the first episode, he's talking about Biden's inauguration and election. So, coming right up to the moment, basically, but then also delving way back to what Adam Curtis sees as the roots of, really the way he describes it, as our general malaise right now, a sense of paralysis that more or less across the whole political spectrum, across the whole West, and even in China and Russia and other sort of nations that may have a very different cultural background from the United States. Ooh, just had some thunder there. It's pouring rain where I am. But even in these places where it's, there's a big cultural difference, there still seems to be this sense of paralysis and this sense that something has gone badly wrong. Everyone knows something has gone badly wrong, but we're not sure how to move on, is the way that he puts it. And a lot of what he talks about, especially in these first two episodes, which we're going to be reviewing, episode 1, entitled Bloodshed on Wolf Mountain, and episode 2 called Shooting and Fucking are the same thing. These two episodes I wanted to talk about together because I think they work together really well to sort of tell the story of how collectivism and the idea of mass democracy, a bunch of people getting together for one common cause, sort of stuttered and failed after it seemed like it had made a lot of successes, or might have been on the ascendancy, with the rise of some socialist countries, the welfare state in the West, the fact that democracy seemed to be spreading everywhere. And then yet something happened around the 1960s, late 1950s, maybe 1960s, where individualism became the ascendant ideology. And Adam Curtis, from later delving into his other works, because this is the first thing by Adam Curtis I ever saw, but I've learned from looking at some of his other works that this is a very common theme with him. But just to say what I liked about it and what drew me to it, this series, is that it is very artistic. In addition to being a philosophical series, in addition to being a very political series, this is a series that Adam Curtis uses he likes to combine a lot of interesting combinations of soundtrack and imagery, drawing on a lot of stock footage, a lot of the wealth of archival footage that the BBC has and other places, to sort of create these collages where the meaning might not be literally what you're seeing, or might not be it might not be a strictly logical progression of images and sounds, and yet it conveys something like an emotional truth or something, which is what he's trying to convey. He's trying to reach out and tell an emotional history of the modern world, which is a very ambitious project. So it almost has to be a little artistic. But I guess so on that note, Matt, did you have any initial reactions? Since I've seen this now, the whole series, a couple times, and really it's been swirling around in my head for a while. Did you have, because this is your first time seeing it and you've just seen the first two episodes, what is your impression so far? Do you have any initial thoughts?
What I always try to keep in mind when I'm watching documentaries nowadays is something you don't keep in mind when you're, say, a little younger and you watch documentaries. So, when I'm a kid and I watched a documentary, I thought of it as, this is the director giving me uncut reality. This is true reality TV. This is the world as is. But then you get older and you watch more and more documentaries and you realize that, as you say, there's an artistic element to it. You're picking and choosing the information you're talking about. You're picking and choosing the imagery. You're picking and choosing the music. So that's one of those things where, like, art and also I guess to put it in like Nietzschean terms, it's kind of, you could say in a documentary, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, try to come together in a one cohesive whole. The documentary is kind of almost proving my intuitions, or is fleshing out the facts on the ground, kind of the nature of society around the world, the political and economic realities, and the cultural realities. I always had certain suspicions, or I've had, not always, but I've had certain suspicions about these matters for a long time. So the director is basically confirming my suspicions. Like I said, obviously, since it's an artistic production, I can't take everything in it. I can't think of it as gospel. But I'm still under the impression that he's giving reality. He's giving me a picture of reality, just in an artistic way.
It's the when Foucault talked about lenses to view reality. It's almost like he's got the certain lens that, I mean, there's the famous phrase, I think you brought it up in the last stream we did, of all art is propaganda. And I would certainly apply that here. I mean, sure, it's in the vulgar sense, it's propaganda. But what I really see it as is he has a certain lens of viewing things that it might not tell the whole picture, but it elucidates some of the big ideas driving the, what would you call it, the politics on the ground, as you put it, of broader society. And we talked a little bit before we started rolling how, in political discussions, it's very easy to get lost in the minutia, and are you for this policy or that policy, or how do you define yourself in this, that, and the other. And typically that is what has more of a bearing on your life, especially in the local level. But what I think this Can't Get You Out of My Head does very well is shows how these big ideas that exist inside people's heads across the whole population, this sort of broad frame of viewing reality, it affects how it affects the reality on the ground in a profound way as well, because that sort of flows through everyone and everything. That particular story he's telling, it's kind of a subversion. Maybe this will be the first sort of topic to get into it, talking about Carrie Thornley and the Discordian movement and the counterculture. A common theme with Adam Curtis is he sort of subverts the normal narrative of the hippie movement and the counterculture. That a lot of people tend to think of that cultural expression in the 60s as being this, how would you put it, this force for change. Whereas it seems like he sees it as, this was actually a manifestation of individualism, that a lot of that collective energy wasn't working anymore. And so people started to express radicalism in terms of just sort of, in the arts, or as a matter of just self-expression. The whole idea of Discordianism, that you define your own reality and no one else can define it for you. Or the idea where he talks about in the second episode how the white radicals came to help this one character, Michael DeFreitas, later Michael X. But there was sort of a change where they took on a more managerial function. But one of the things he shows is they sort of become hippies. There's a guy playing the guitar, and the lyrics that he sang, it stuck out to me on a repeat viewing. He's saying, the lyrics are, and there's no more war because there's no more world. And I was kind of thinking in terms of like, what does that mean? Well, it's probably the John Lennon sort of imagine thing, right? Imagine there's no countries. There's no more world or geopolitics happening. That's sort of the goal. We're just all one world. We're all just individuals. There's none of these competing political factions. And that all sounds like a very noble idea. And that counterculture I was raised to think was a very noble idea and a force for change. But I feel that this does sort of call that into question a little bit.
So, pardon me, I'm chewing on a lot of tater tots that I got from my dining hall because I'm eating food which the capitalist overlords want me to eat, which will make me die of a heart attack at 60.
Potato will make you strong.
But anyway, so I sort of see two ideas. I think the director is trying to talk about. I think there's two aspects of the situation that you mentioned. One is that the many aspects of the counterculture were just simply expressions of this individualism that began to take hold around the world. But two, I don't see him completely dismiss the counterculture in the sense that he seems to be almost weeping about the fact that the issue with the counterculture perhaps is it wasn't counterculture enough. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the conservative line nowadays from someone like, say, Ben Shapiro basically is like, well, the counterculture movement was insane. It went too far. And now, society, the Western world has degenerated because of these crazy hippies who believed in communism or whatever.
Right.
But I think.
But I mean, yeah, if you compare the hippies to because in this documentary, you could hold that up into stark contrast to what's going on in Maoist China. And it's really not at all the same kind of movement, I mean, it's complicated because he argues that Jiang Zheng, who I'm sure we'll talk about, was driven by a sort of radical individual identity. But just importantly, when you look out across that sea of people and that sea of red flags, it's a very different vibe from the counterculture, if you catch my meaning. Something I heard Adam Curtis say in an interview is that he thinks culture will be regarded as one of the conservative forces of this era. Because of how just the premise is wrong that you're changing society through art, in his opinion.
So what I kind of see this documentary saying, basically, what people have forgotten recently, and what people began to think about in the 1960s and 70s and then promptly forgot for reasons we'll get into, is that the way you feel, the way you experience the world is not just doesn't come from, say, original sin. It's not as if
right.
You and I are just these broken individuals that need. Of course, it used to be God. Now it would just be the elites that are need to control us because we're just so flawed and monstrous. The documentary is saying, well, no. It's human society is makes you what you are as much as the individual, or as much as just your own idiosyncrasies. And so an individual can be happy or unhappy based on the broader world around him. But what I find interesting is that's actually a radical idea, at least it would be to many people. So you and I and our friend Kohei will probably do a live stream on my channel pretty soon about Jordan Peterson. And I could just see Jordan Peterson rolling his eyes at that part of the documentary because he's always saying, well, no, clean your room. You don't know what the heck you're talking about. You shouldn't be thinking about changing your society because you're just so horrid that you don't know how to take care of your own life. Right. And so just focus on yourself and basically accept your religion, accept kind of traditional values, because that the collective, the historical collective, so to speak, knows better than you do. Right. And just kind of shut up about it.
You better be damn. I'm not even sure that you've got your house in order before you go about trying to change the world, Bucko.
Now, I don't even think Jordan Peterson follows his own advice there. But point being,
he has a filthy desk. It's totally in disarray.
Point being, I think that's totally accurate. I do think it's not just flawed individuals that are ruining the world. It is the way our society is structured is making people kind of unhappy, I guess, to put it bluntly.
Well, and I thought of Peterson a lot at the end of episode 2 with the story of sort of the West German revolutionaries. They more or less figure out that there were a lot of people who were still in government who had been former Nazis or had collaborated with the Nazis to a greater or lesser degree. And they set out to what does he say? I love the way he says it. He's like, we set out to implement sabotage in the centers of imperialism. Things go on. They become allied with Palestinian revolutionaries. And then the Palestinians and West Germans team up to hijack a plane. It ends up landing in Uganda, which was another sort of regime hostile to the Western powers generally. And then the Islamic part of that group of ostensibly anti-imperialists then divides up the Jews from the non-Jews and says that, or the Israelis from the non-Israelis, and says we will execute the Israelis if the demands aren't met or if they try to storm the plane or whatever the case may be. He talks about how Horst Mahler and the other revolutionaries, that made them see it's basically exactly what Jordan Peterson says, that like the same stuff that's inside the fascists is in you can go to those same dark places. And they had been led down that place, us trying to fight the fact that there were still Nazis in government, the main crime of the Nazis being the oppression of the Jews. And then here they were sort of like circling back to that same awful reality. And that's where Adam Curtis basically narrates that a lot of them began to feel, okay, maybe the problem is within me. I think you're right that like both of those things are kind of true, but I think like the horror of that, of seeing the in the failures of all these revolutions, collectivist revolutions, and seeing how they can become authoritarian and corrupt, the horror of that, I think maybe scared a lot of people off into almost like just fleeing into that. Like individualism has a sort of appeal because it is, it kind of absolves you from the responsibility of changing the world as well. And that's one of the things that Jordan Peterson talks a lot about, is responsibility. But it is interesting that he says, well, no, your responsibility is first to yourself, and only later should you think about changing the world. Whereas I think, especially by the end of the series, and I'm sure you'll have a lot of thoughts on it as we reach the very end, but I definitely was inspired to more think, no, it is sort of my responsibility to change the whole world, insofar as, it's all of it's like we're the only ones who can, so to speak, we all participate in the society. We all have a role to play in the society. We all contribute. The power structure moves through everybody. And so I actually came away thinking, no, there is a broader responsibility. But I don't know. This documentary shows all those revolutions, all these idealistic attempts to change the world just got undermined.
Yeah. So when watching this documentary, I think kind of made me oscillate between, a more hopeful, optimistic view of human relations and a more pessimistic and fatalistic view of human relations, which I think is intended by Adam Curtis, or at least, sort of the disillusionment with, I guess, revolution, you could say, that people in this documentary, the people in that were focused on the documentary felt. I could feel that a little bit myself, watching the documentary, even though I wasn't alive, when all this stuff happened, so I didn't go through it myself. So I think a lot about like just revolutions throughout history, just because they're kind of interesting. And you think about, I don't know, the French Revolution, the American Revolution. Well, I guess I'm gonna leave the American Revolution out for a second. The French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, the Iranian Revolution. You think about these kind of populist, I guess you could broadly say left-wing revolutions that sprang up. If that's how we're going to categorize them, at least. Certain aspects of those revolutions came from sort of left-wing populist thought, I would say, even though we'll get into the complexities in a second. I can't bring myself to say the Russian Revolution, the ideas that were spread by these various revolutions, I don't think can be just easily dismissed, as they often are by, conservatives and liberals in the West. Like when the Berlin Wall fell, the fall of the Berlin Wall is the sign that revolution is just a completely terrible idea and it never works, and we just have to reject that completely, and this neoliberal corporatist society is basically as good as it's going to get, and so we must keep people in their dream world for that very reason. And maybe this is because I was born, a while after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I've just seen what the world is like in the first part of the 21st century. I don't think that would have been the conclusion, or I don't think that was the proper conclusion from the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Well,
I know we have to acknowledge that.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say what you were just describing of that. It's capitalist realism, usually what people call it. The idea that neoliberal capitalism is all there is or will be. It's the only thing that'll work.
And that's not to say that there aren't aggressive impulses within individuals, or that's not to say that if you are going to fight in a revolutionary way, doesn't mean you should dismiss the failures of the revolutions as just totally exterior factors that have nothing to do with human nature or human flaws. But I think we shouldn't use human nature, human flaws to justify non-action and just to justify a system the system we have right now, which I would say is very sinister.
Yeah, the themes he talks about in the very beginning of that sense of paralysis, that everyone knows something's wrong, but we can't do anything about it. I think it applies just as much to the communist East as to the liberal West. And I think that's maybe a case that's made here, is that America, who defined itself as individualistic, to contrast ourselves with the collectivist Soviet Union, in the end run, we kind of have given up on both of those dreams in a way. Neither one has really panned out. Or to take like a broader historical look at society and say, okay, all of these systems and ways of doing things and ways of organizing society are temporary and they change over time. And, you know, anyone who back in, you know, the 1600s said, oh, we're never going to have this democracy thing that we're hearing whispers of. Society can never move on from that. We just have to accept reality that there is a natural hierarchy, or, you know, something of that nature. People said the same thing before the Industrial Revolution. They would have, you know, been unable to imagine a lot of the ways of life that exist today, where you don't have mass agrarian populations. So I think it's very clear we're or maybe this is controversial, but it's clear to me, we're on the cusp of something new. It could be very bad, or it could be very good. Or we can keep doing what it feels like the powers that be want to do, so to speak, the powers that be. But, you know, politicians, international finance, all these people, the people who are currently benefiting from the system want it to just sort of go on forever. And so that's why they sort of disseminate this idea to everyone that gets into everyone's head that it's going to go on forever. And it has to go on forever because there's no alternative. It's the best thing we've ever come up with as humans. You know, what is the famous conservative saying or I think it was Winston Churchill who said it was, that capitalism is or democracy is the worst system on earth except for all the others. And that's sort of how a lot of capitalist realists talk about capitalism. Again, to bring in Jordan Peterson, that's how he talks about capitalism. Like, he'll even say, oh, it's a horrible system, but it's better than trying to centrally plan the economy. You know, so I don't know. I guess to move on from that, maybe just the idea of these general like failed revolutions. There's another subtext in these first two episodes of that force that is rising up to sort of build this dream world and keep people under control. And that is basically technology giving way to the modern day like surveillance state. Because of course the way that the West German revolutionaries were ultimately caught was by gathering a bunch of data on them and predicting, you know, where they would be hiding out in the city, and it worked, and they were able to catch them. But then, you know, there's that rather ominous, I think it's in Curtis's narration, a very ominous idea that people begin to have the idea, well, we could make the whole world safe if we could only gather data on everyone. And that was inconceivable in, you know, the early 60s when those events were taking place, where computers were still sort of a novelty. But now it's basically the reality that we are actually living in.
Well, I just finished a class when it was focused on the novel 1984 by George Orwell. It was a college research class, and I had to write a paper at the end. But the focus of the research class, the focus or the topic that the research class took was about Orwell's novel. So I read that novel very thoroughly, and I thought a lot about that novel. But the argument's been going around for quite a long time that, like, well, you know, Orwell's basically a prophet, and you know, we're either living or we're going to live in a 1984-esque society where everyone is controlled by technology. Again, that's a very simplistic argument. I don't know if I would go that far, but if we think about what the documentary is putting forth, it is kind of saying that something like that could happen. So I forget the name of the gentleman, the one that originally was using computers to track the revolutionaries and terrorists.
Oh yeah. I forget his name. I think it was another guy named Horst, like Horst Harold. Yeah. I think was his name. So there's a lot of people in Germany named Horst.
So he gave this speech basically where he said, like a lot of this counterculture violence, or these revolutions that are going on around the world, they are a symptom of the old system of power attempting to stay alive, attempting to continue on. So even though like people thought, even though after the Second World War the world had been changed forever, those old power structures were hanging on, and some would say they're still there. And so the people were kind of revolting against that, against those old forces. And so this guy gave a speech and said, well, that's what's causing these uprisings, this violence, this these counterculture movements and revolutions that seem to be going horribly wrong. What are we going to do about it? And I guess what kind of does scare me a little bit, even though I'm not trying to sound like a paranoid person, what scares me is it does seem like we're going in that direction of using technology just to spy on everybody, so no one rocks the boat too much. What I like about this documentary is he is arguing against the people that basically have this idea: West good, Eastern communism bad, Asian communism bad. Like he's showing that even if even if neoliberal capitalism has been more sustainable, at least in the short term, even if it hasn't led to bloodshed in quite the same way as some of these communist revolutions, he's not agreeing with the idea that, oh, well, those communist revolutionaries are just terrible people and the West is fundamentally good. No, he's saying all across the world, people are doing terrible things. And you could almost argue that if we do end up living in a society where where the West implements this mass surveillance technology, you could argue that at the end of the day, that was worse or more evil than the evils committed by these, communist revolutionaries.
What the surveillance state is just sort of why it's terrifying is how the technology's developed. But what I think the documentary does a good job of is showing you, even though we've all read about all these historical events, like there's not a whole lot in this whole series that I mean, there's actually quite a bit of little bits of knowledge I didn't know about, but the general events that he's talking about, I mostly knew about. But it's like little details almost that produce that sense of like almost deja vu, or like really feeling the paralysis. And it's you realize it's like, okay, the technology is different now, but it's old decaying power coming up against, either the individual fighting against the old decaying power, or it's an attempt at collectivism to overthrow the old decaying power structure. But it's almost like a Thucydides trap, which Thucydides famously came up with the idea of like an ascendant power will always end up going to war with the older geopolitical power. He's talking about nations, but I almost see it's like this social unrest will start to well up as the power of the state declines. It's something like that like the ideology of the status quo, as it declines, it almost produces like an internal Thucydides trap where other ideologies will come up to challenge it. And I think that's what we're talking about. But then you realize it's like over the years, this has happened again and again and again. And all of these failures have sort of led people to just accept the status quo and this dream state. I think of, for example, the very beginning, he talks about, it's like one of the first things as we go back to 1950s Britain, when the empire was kind of falling apart. The first things we hear about is scandals from finance, people embezzling money, or not embezzling, but doing insider trading and then getting away with it. And then military power being used in a colonial fashion in Kenya to suppress like a revolutionary movement there. And you kind of realize, you're like, okay, the United States military power, what were we doing over the past number of decades? Well, we were suppressing all of these revolutionary movements in these Middle Eastern countries that we're trying to keep a hold of, using things like torture and psychological abuse in Guantanamo Bay, which is
not to mention the Vietnam War and the horrors related to that.
Sure. Well, there's Vietnam, but I'm almost saying like just thinking about like what's going on now, how we can talk about these events of finance getting away scot-free with these crimes, military going out of control. Same things happening today in America. And you just see it's like, okay, it's just this endlessly repeating pattern. The popular rage against it always seems to get diffused, or at least it has since, the time of the 60s radicals, for example. that's sort of another, I guess, thread of all this. If we're talking about the surveillance state, which is like hard power, I don't know how you would classify finance. You could call it a sort of soft power. It's like finance, global finance is sort of like the other force that's coming in to manage the world's systems in the wake of sort of mass democracy not really being able to change the world, being the force for change that we thought it was. Well, I guess what's interesting is that he draws the connection that in 1958, when supposedly the British Empire as an empire had more or less ended and they decolonialized, it was still the banks who had been at the center of the empire profiteering. It was still the military running rampant. And that's what we see more or less with the United States today as well. That's happening in a democratic, liberal Western country. That's not happening in some scary Eastern despotism or in one of the evil, bad communist countries. It's like we're still capable of manifesting the old forms of power that never really went away.
Well, I hope this isn't too irrelevant, but so I'm someone who was very influenced from a young age by the New Atheists. And I just want to bring up kind of Sam Harris for a minute. You know, as much as, I mean, I still highly respect their New Atheists and their work, and they really taught me how to think, I would say. They were a fundamental, or that they were an important moment in my intellectual development, if you will. So I can't dismiss them that much. But if you look at someone like Sam Harris, in parts of his work, he likes to focus on the dangers of radical Islam and, you know, how that really is the fundamental problem nowadays. Kind of like how Christopher Hitchens did it, but Sam Harris does it in a slightly more sophisticated fashion because he wasn't a supporter of the Iraq War, so he can get away with a bit more than, say, Hitch could. And then you remember the emails he exchanged with Noam Chomsky. The older I've gotten, the more I think... I mean, I've always kind of been more sympathetic to Chomsky than Harris in that argument, but the older I get, the more I think Chomsky is fundamentally correct in that matter. You know, as much of an issue as radical Islam might be, it's really the kind of big Western powers have the capacity to destroy human civilization, that they're really the ones that are we need to be focused. The anger needs to be directed towards them, at least from my perspective, because I mean, like obviously you and I would agree that ISIS is a bad organization, an evil organization, an organization that is destructive. But I mean, ISIS doesn't have as much power as the United States government or certain banks.
Last several administrations are staffed. Presidential administrations are staffed with a lot of people from finance and Goldman Sachs and Wall Street. We
really need to look at our the flaws of and the malicious actions of the Western leaders, which I think are more of a threat than some other, you know, minor terrorist groups across the world.
Yeah, well, and I'm also talking about this. I'm very excited when we get to episode 5. But yeah, it's like, what does Michael X say? He's talking about Britain, but he I guess white people generally, he says, unfortunately, we find that people of pale pigmentation are so savage that even though they have enough missiles to like destroy all of human civilization, they're still building even more. And so, yeah, it's like it is very easy to with the Western media, especially, to like regard America as exemplary, but in terms of the butcher's bill on our hands, it's pretty serious. That being said, so I guess maybe we could pivot from here. The portion on China covered in this, because that covers, I guess, the other side of things of not presenting a too rosy view of the communist like regimes. But mainly, the first couple episodes, he talks about Jiang Xing and the Maoist regime, and how 30 million people died of starvation as a result of the Great Leap Forward. And then, sort of following this, was this cultural revolution. I don't know. I guess maybe I'll open it up to you for just if you had any reactions. But maybe my initial reaction is that. Maybe it kind of goes against what I was saying earlier of art as a conservative force, because you could argue that Jiang Xing used art to like whip people up into this frenzy. Like when they interview the one woman who says, well, I saw the revolutionary play, and then accompanied with like the lecture from Jiang Xing, it like moved me and made me like really believe in the revolution and all of that. I don't know. Maybe it's not the problem isn't the medium necessarily. Maybe it is the problem with the radicalism is it's actually not. It isn't actually an expression of a desire to change the world, or it isn't actually the art of the counterculture or the radicals, the hippies didn't have the power to change the world the way that, say, Jiang Qing's revolutionary plays did. But then on the other side of that, and that's why it's hard to say any definitive statements. On the other side of that, the Cultural Revolution, in a sense, really just kind of failed because it fizzled out and it didn't destroy like what she saw as the old power structure still in people's heads. It ended up just being like a frenzy of violence and resentment. I think that's why, by the way, because you've brought this up before, why Eric Weinstein recently referred to the Democrats as Maoists. And when you look at what the Maoists actually did during the Cultural Revolution, it is very ridiculous to like compare the two, because no Democrats have like dragged people out and made them wear like signs saying like I'm a demon, and like one person said they like killed somebody's mother and like killed their family members, pushed people off buildings. A lot of people committed suicide, were tortured. But I think what Weinstein is trying to say is not like the Democrats have become ideologically very far left in terms of economics, but more that it's like the cancel culture thing, I think, is what he sees, of like go and be an internet lynch mob. It's like the internet version of Maoism, of the Maoist Cultural Revolution, is like getting canceled on Twitter. But I think that highlights exactly really kind of what Adam Curtis is saying, because all of that internet canceling and that rage, that's really just that's another form of individualistic expression that's on this digital dream world, where people can go and be like, oh, I did something, I canceled somebody, I shut down this evil voice that was harming people. I'm not saying that's harmless or that I agree with any of that, because I don't. I'm actually very against that. But it is largely like a playground for people to go and play, having like political wars when they're not actually like changing policy or changing the reality on the ground for people. They're just sort of targeting people based on having bad beliefs or whatever. And so anyway, I think looking into like the Cultural Revolution, I see why people have said that about the Democrats. But when you really, I don't know, understand how the digital world is a diffusion of all of that revolutionary energy, and you really compare what actually happened in the horrors of the Cultural Revolution to what's happening today, you realize it's kind of ridiculous. And that actually all of that expression of cancel culture now is sort of like, it's almost like a pale imitation of what that Maoism was. I think maybe a lot of the people doing it, the so-called SJWs, might wish they could do something like the Cultural Revolution, but they're too busy posting to do it. Like they're trapped in this dream world to do it, where they that's what it is. So,
well, at some level, you don't necessarily have to, like, you're not necessarily wrong to say that art or culture can be a conservative force, because I'm very bad with names. I'm sorry. Could you give me the name of Mao's wife again?
Jiang Qing.
Jiang Qing. Thank you. So Jiang Qing, I mean, she was pulling, she was taking like old Chinese stories and turning them into operas. But as the documentary mentions, like what had happened, I mean, even if ultimately the Cultural Revolution was just meant for, it was just Mao's attempt to hold on to power. What he and Jiang Qing released was this anger and this violence that had been, in Chinese society for much longer than it had been, probably for centuries. So at some level, I mean, they were just pulling, they were taking these old feelings, these old beliefs, and letting them run free. And it was just, they were letting them run free under the name of Marxism, Leninism. Of course, China and Mao's reign is somewhat interesting, because I remember Philip Short, who's written a biography on Mao and a biography on Pol Pot. He said in a lecture that Maoism, or Marxism-Leninism, Maoism, is Marxism seen through the lens of Confucianism. Okay. And Confucianism, of course, is an extremely conservative worldview, and a conservative, and Confucius was not a bomb throwing revolutionary. He did not want to fundamentally change society. He wanted people to accept kind of how society was, and he's kind of like the Chinese Jordan Peterson, except far more intelligent.
Oh man.
But
Wow.
I just wanted to make one more quick point. I keep taking shots at Jordan Peterson, I know, but I just
that was
wanted
a shot at Confucius.
Maybe it was, but to mention like Eric Weinstein and the IDW. Well, you touched on this a little, but what irritates me about the IDW as a whole is, I mean, I think they talk the talk about like, oh, fundamentally changing society, and because the society isn't acceptable now. But all I really see them do is attack the internet SJWs. Like, oh, look at these stupid SJWs. We can't be like them. We believe in the battle of ideas. We believe in freedom of expression. But I don't see them really talking about or advocating for anything that's really going to fundamentally change the power structure. I really see them as, at some level, they're a diversion. They're a welcome diversion to the elites in power, because they can talk about, oh, these crazy radical leftists are trying to destroy Western civilization, get people riled up, get people watching Dave Rubin, let's say.
It's a taking the battlefield from the real and the political into this digital cultural, I mean, I say playground, but it's almost like, you could argue that like maybe you sort of have a cathartic experience when you see like an 80s action movie, right? That all humans have this capacity for brutality, and you watch Die Hard and that fulfills that. And you don't actually need to, if you're a moral, civilized person, you don't need to go out and kill people. You restrain that anyway. I'm not saying Die Hard stops you from doing that, but you have it deep inside you, you could argue. And that kind of gives you an outlet, you could say, for like the darker side of humanity. And that's what I would argue like Twitter is basically, to a large extent, is on the political level. It's like a catharsis that in the past, maybe people would have fought a civil war or something. We have this like surrogate now for that, where we can just fight it out online, but it doesn't change anything in the culture really. And it doesn't, the important thing too, you can't stop it by fighting it in that same domain. Because if you go and post about how you hate cancel culture, you're still just in that same battleground. There's no way out of it in that realm. And so I think, yeah, it is a force that behooves the current power structure, that people have this sort of playground for ideological dispute that doesn't affect the real world really at all. And the Confucian thing, that's interesting. I don't know if I'd ever heard that, but it explains a lot about Mao's famous phrase that it's communism with Chinese characteristics, and how, I do know a bit about Confucianism, and how, at least in the political ideology, there's the idea of the emperor or the central figure, the leader, and it's through their moral uprightness that it sort of radiates out. It's like they're the center. You would see it as sort of like the central like anchor of society in some way. Is like the person at the top, and then they're surrounded by their ministers, and it sort of goes out through that. And so there's like a responsibility in Confucianism for the leader to be moral and virtuous. But the other side of that coin is that they have more or less absolute power. Yeah, it's like it's interesting that throughout that whole power struggle that Adam Curtis documents in the film, mainly in the first two episodes with Zhang Sheng's story, is that there's never really any pretense that what this is represents like the popular will of China. Everyone more or less knows these are different like factions or different revolutionary leaders who have basically overthrown the old elite of society, and now they're the new elite. It's not based on the old bloodlines. It's not based on necessarily the maybe older ideas of the emperor being divine, for example. But it is still based on the idea of there has to be this elite that from which the morality of the culture flows forth. And so, it's a civil war among the elites is basically what happens during the Cultural Revolution, which is interesting when you consider that the entire premise of the whole thing is supposed to be, this is giving power back to the people. And yet all the actors involved in the power struggle seem to understand that's not really what happened here.
So I was talking to my friend the other day, and he made I think the conversation had been inspired by listening to some Janis Joplin, but we started talking about like the 60s, and my friend said, well, we basically live in the second 60s. We basically live in a time that parallels the 60s. And I started thinking about that more, and I think he's right about that. And I guess I bring that up because, of course, what you do realize watching this documentary is that the Black Panthers, the Maoists, people who were trying to fight the power structure, many of them did retain the old way of viewing things. They did retain what had been taught to them by the, if you forgive the phrase, ancien régime. I'm sorry I used such a barbaric language such as French, but please don't execute me. So anyway,
the guillotine for you.
The guillotine for Monsieur de Hazelwood. Mathieu, yes. I mean, I think that's true. I guess a criticism of these revolutionary groups is that many of the people at the heads of these revolutionary groups did retain these ideas. They were masking the old ideas as revolution. Well, and so to connect that back with, the possibility that we live in kind of 60s part 2 or however you want to describe it. I mean, that makes me think, like, is this the time when we finally can move past some of these old ideas? Like, is this when the 60s is the promise of the 60s, or the promise of the 60s to break with the old system and start anew? Is this when we finally see the fulfillment? Is this a time we'll finally see the fulfillment of that? Because at some level people say, well, the 60s were a complete failure. And I understand why they say that. But maybe it just took this long for things to start, actually falling into place. Because I think about my life, and I'm 21. I was born in 99, and I still find myself having these, internal battles with myself, because I am trying to get away from what the ancient regime taught me indirectly through my parents and the school system and the broader culture more generally. At some level, that's an individual battle you have to fight first, so you can take more collective action, I suppose. But then, as we mentioned in the earlier part of this conversation, maybe this is the funeral of the 60s. Maybe this is when everything gets put to bed and the human society is just going to go down a dark path, which we don't even want to comprehend. It
makes me think very sort of in the way that the Marxists, their whole system of history, dialectical materialism, is sort of the idea springing from Hegel that to act is to err, and that therefore every time you sort of one zeitgeist propels society forward, it contains its own contradiction as the kernel of its own undoing, more so to speak, is contained within that zeitgeist. And so every sort of time history moves or society moves in one direction, it creates the possibility for whatever new state of affairs exists to be overthrown. But that way of looking at history is very interesting to me, because it's sort of, for one, speaking of what we've been talking about, it's very Chinese. But there's a saying in China that I can't quite remember the Chinese phrase for, but it's basically the idea that when something reaches the extreme, it necessarily creates the opposite reaction of whatever the opposite of that force is. And it's very contained within the yin yang idea. And so I kind of can't help but wonder if maybe we had, what would you call it, sort of the last gasp of the ancient regime of the idea of this natural hierarchy, that democracy in various forms over the centuries, and it's easy to forget, it took centuries and centuries and centuries of democratic and socialist, sometimes violent uprisings, sometimes peaceful movements, sometimes electorally they got into power through the parliaments that existed in countries that had kind of half democratized but still had a constitutional monarchist system. Over these centuries, we had this idea of, whether it was socialism or democracy, collective power of the people rising up. I think the argument here is we saw basically the end of that, and what that gave birth to was this individualism. I think what we're seeing now is the individualism being supplanted by this, it's kind of a scary thing, managerialism, that there are these professionals who need to manage our lives, or technocrats. It seems to be the direction that it's going, all over the world. And that's a very scary future. And I think that's the origin of a lot of the dystopic ideas of where we're headed. The idea that we all just need to be managed by people who are our betters. you kind of realize that we've like looped back around to almost feudalism in that sense. Because if Bezos knows best, or Zuckerberg knows best, or all of the very smart algorithms that they've created know best, and they know you better than you know you. And all these societal systems are too complex for the human mind, and they just should need to be run by machines. I mean, it almost might be like even the transhumanist idea that society is so complex it has to be run by AI. All of those things are really, I think, unpalatable, I would say, to most people. I definitely see it like we're headed for like an inflection point or like a precipice where we'll either go down that road or there will be something that will come up that will somehow like synthesize those contradictions of individualism and collectivism, of like the collective power, but respecting the rights of the individual, somehow rise up in all of this. Because the alternative is like this almost inhuman totalitarianism in a sense. And it can even come out of, as you pointed out before, it's not just coming out of like Eastern, like Russia or China. This really is being pioneered just as much by our own governments, our own tech companies, our own finance systems. One of my favorite lines in the whole thing is when he's talking, or he has the interview from Stokely Carmichael, who was one of the early Black Panthers, who I think created the phrase Black Power, where he points out, he's like, the argument I made is that it was very Nietzschean, is what I like about it. Is he says the argument I made was not based on morality. It was just simply based on a power difference. Like, we Black people had no power. If we wanted anything, we had to attain some power. It's not about like it's right or wrong or whatever. And I think it's like that insight, if you apply it to a class and not a racial struggle, that's like the basis of class consciousness. I think a lot of the old Marxist models of how the class system works are a little outdated because of modern technology and how things have changed. But I guess my hope is that we would all recognize that thing that Stokely Carmichael said, that it's like societal change and shaping the society we want. Ultimately, there is like, you have to contend with the power structure as it is, because it will try to hold on and it doesn't ever cede anything. And to do that, we need like that. I mean, the only thing we have is like that collective power. But how do we get that? How do we overcome the individualism that our societies have all created, that sort of keeps us atomized and unable to really band together? And that's like the big question that I feel we're not going to answer here.
Well, I like to joke that by the end of the 21st century, we will see a big revolution take place. I don't expect to. I like to think it won't happen in my lifetime, so I'm not an old man and the world's crumbling around me. But I do often, it's partly a joke, but there is some truth to that, I think. I mean, I think people are becoming more aware of what's going on, even though the whole point of this surveillance, the whole point of the state using this surveillance technology is lulling people to sleep. I'm not sure they're actually successfully lulling people to sleep. I mean, they have to a certain degree, of course, because there isn't a revolution going on right now. I don't know. The part that makes me optimistic is I don't know if they will succeed in lulling the people to sleep, because I do see a lot of signs of people kind of, what's that Marxist term? Consciousness raising. And of course, people like to dismiss Marx nowadays and talk about what a terrible person he was and all the things he got wrong. The longer I live and the more I read about Marx, the more I feel like he might have the last laugh on many people. As you say, there's certain aspects of his analysis which no longer make sense, because the 21st century is different from when the 19th century, when he lived. Yeah,
and I'm not like a Marxist. I've never like seriously been like into Marx. But it's more like, I like the descriptive aspects of the Marxist philosophy, of how they describe the movement of history and things like that, and exactly. Being materially grounded, saying first and foremost, this is about material conditions, kind of what we were talking about earlier, of how that idea started to get undermined, of that it is the conditions of society that are causing people to revolt or to, fall into drug abuse or fall into poverty or to succeed, as it may be, that it's the conditions of society and the power structure that creates those things. It's not just individual responsibility, which is, that always hinges on like, oh, well, everyone has free will and they've got this moral responsibility, these intangible, almost magical ideas that when you look out and you examine the big picture, people are fairly predictable in how they're going to behave, like on a statistical large scale level. And yeah, I also wonder about that, whether we're like, are the people being lulled to sleep? Well, in some sense, the social media algorithms kind of whip people up. In the same way, maybe a Jiangxing revolutionary play whips people up. You could say it has the same effect. I mean, look, this wasn't scripted, but the George Floyd video, that whipped a bunch of people up into protest, and in some cases, violent protest. That was a powerful representation. We kind of talked shit about Eric Weinstein, but he had a very good description of it, where he said it was symbolic. It was the state literally kneeling on someone's throat, which is like the imagery that we often use symbolically to talk about, like the boot heel of the state coming down on you. And we all watched it like strangle and kill somebody. So that has a very powerful effect on like the whole community's sort of psyche. And so I can see that sort of like through social media. Yeah, there might be things that could whip up and destabilize the population just as easily as they could like live in a dream world. We're dealing with power on the technology sense in some level that we don't really understand or can't predict the outcomes of. And maybe that's why these ideas gain appeal of, well, these systems are too complicated for any one person. And so it needs to be run by AI and by managers and professionals and all that.
I just want to add something really quickly to what you said, and then we can talk about the more technical aspects of the documentary. This is just a thought I had off the top of my head, but I wonder if it like if one looked at history, a pattern of like the two aspects of human nature, the one that kind of wants to be lulled to sleep and the one that wants to be told what to do because you don't have to be because freedom is anxiety provoking, and then the part that does want to embrace that anxiety provoking freedom, and the part that does want the part of the individual that inspires him or her to control his or her own life and not be told what to do. But I guess I'm speculating. Maybe you could extrapolate this to history, just seeing the constant struggle between, I guess, to put it in Nietzschean terms again, the master and slave morality, the desire to, if we take master morality in the most, I guess, charitable sense, that might be a bad way of putting it. But this desire for freedom and this desire for slavery, I think we all kind of have this to some degree. And when the society is kind of lulling you into slavery, people revolt and embrace freedom. But at that, you could say maybe in and of itself might lull people into slavery and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. There's like this excitement and this real thrill of life to be found in like what would you call like individual freedom and liberty and all that. But there's also this like amount of like comfort and safety and just like staying within the status quo. And I think that is like where most people are at mentally now, is for all of like the culture war stuff. I think it's been shown more or less there's no really popular will to revolt. I mean, the closest we got was the Capitol insurrection. And that was that had no chance of leading to a revolt, but it was a physical representation of frustration and anger. But yet again, they just kind of wandered around aimlessly within the halls of Congress. They tried to launch a revolution and then realized they didn't even know what to do. Like they don't know, like no one knows how to get out of this paralysis. It's like we need a new vision of the future, so to speak, like a new idea of where this is going before we can really go there. And that's so, yeah, I guess to then tie this into maybe some final thoughts on just the technical side of things. That's how the documentary starts, is with a quote from David Graeber that says the ultimate hidden truth of the world is it's something we make and could just as easily make differently. And I think that's a lot of what he's driving at, is having a vision for the future, and how, maybe a lot of why those failed is Jiangxing didn't actually have a new vision for the future. Maybe the West German revolutionaries didn't really have a vision for the future. I mean, they just kind of became Maoist, latched on to the communist ideology, which itself was kind of spinning its wheels at the time. I'm sure you noticed lots of footage of people dancing, which one of the first ones is right after the song Do Nothing, which contains the lyrics, nothing ever change. I'm just living in a life without meaning and living with a life without feeling. We cut to like this image of in Britain in 1958 of this much older man dancing with a girl who looks like she's maybe like 12. And it looks like it's some sort of dance class or something. people doing very experimental, sort of almost yogic looking dancing later. Looking back on these past footage of like these ghosts from the past, it's almost like with all the talk of the empire collapsing, I just can't help but think of the saying of like fiddling while Rome burns. I don't know. It seems if I could put it into words, it sounds very trite when you put it into words, but that's sort of why you express it in artistic form, because otherwise you could just sort of say it, but
I was focusing, I think, a little more on the ideas, so I can't give really specifics of technical. I can't really focus on specific technical aspects, but I guess I'll just give a few thoughts on the unique aspects of documentary film and documentary as a medium for change. Some people have said that the medium for the Cuban Revolution was film. I guess this kind of ties back in then to art, as is art conservative or revolutionary. But I do think documentaries, they can influence people in a revolutionary direction, or they can influence people to want to, become men of action and attempt to change the world.
It's kind of postmodern, but or meta, so to speak. But you could even say that Adam Curtis falls into his own trap by trying to express this through the arts and through a documentary, which raises the question of whether it can have that power. Or
in many ways, humans are visual. That's one of the most important senses of the human being, really, is our what we see. And of course, the documentary is it's different from, say, a novel or a book when you're like kind of you can see the images in your head. It's more internal. It's external. But because film is external, it can cause people to be more sensitive to the message and the ideas being put forth, because it's much more visceral. Maybe in documentary, the thing that you can do is, if you're willing to be artistic with it, combine footage and soundtrack in a way that will produce a certain like emotional reaction. So, like the second segment ends with Stokely Carmichael's speech, which like it's a very long snare drum roll with like a punk soundtrack, basically, of him, and that concludes with him saying like, the gorilla doesn't rap, he studies, he keeps his mouth shut and he study children, study. And I feel like, again, he's talking to an audience, talking about Black Power, but it's like Adam Curtis is manipulating that to put this punk soundtrack that is really building up to the end. And it's like, it makes it feel like he's speaking to you in some sense of like, oh, something's began back here that has been building up. And it's like, and he's sort of reaching across history to tell you, not just his audience, but you, like the current audience, like study what you're seeing and study like the history that we came through, in order to understand sort of like where we're going. When he's talking about the suspicion and the fear in British culture too, it's very interesting how he finds old footage of people sort of like going about their day, but you'll catch like one or two people just sort of in the background who kind of glances at the camera and looks rather suspiciously, almost directly to you at the audience. And it's certainly just an accident that he caught, but there's a lot of little ways of like weaving in those scenes and those like accidents of just happening to capture a real moment that you can then make as part of this potpourri to give a certain emotional sort of like resonance with the audience, so to speak. And of course, having like an Aphex Twin or Nine Inch Nails or some creepy electronica under it can help it make it feel unsettling as well. They say that because we've been talking about the visual aspect, but I've heard, I don't remember who said this, but some filmmaker saying that the score is even more important than the visuals to the audience. Or in terms of setting the emotional tone of the scene. And people have done things like the famous one I remember, the final scene of the original Star Wars, where they get the words from Leia and everyone congratulates the rebel heroes. People have edited that scene so there's no sound or there's no score to it. And without that triumphant score, it's awkward. You don't really know what you're supposed to feel. It's just people walking through like a large room, and you realize how much of like the drama and the feeling of cinema is created by the score that's behind it. And so I feel like he definitely
just, I guess, to bring it back to what you were saying at the beginning, he definitely knows what he's doing in his musical choices of trying to produce that sort of the right emotional tone through that.
In terms of, or when he talks about, or I'm glad you brought up when he talks about like people being very suspicious in British society post World War II. Because actually, I think I sense that suspicion often when I'm interacting with my peers. When I'm acting with, I guess I'm a Gen Zer. Well, I'm a weird person. I'm a weird, or maybe zillennial. Anyway, kind of late millennials, early through the Gen Z generation. I don't know. I get the sense that like there's a much more, people feel much more detached from each other, and there's slightly more suspicion when like someone comes up to you like to be just to be friendly.
Yeah,
it's like people are like a little taken aback, like they think, like, and not that I'm trying to make the silly point that people in the 1950s say we're necessarily more open. At least we've inherited the suspicions from that time. It's still to today. People, if you're not already in someone's inner circle and you interact with them, there's a less of an inclination to like get to know you. I don't know, and that's just a little idiosyncrasy of mine that I noticed people responding to, but I don't think it is. And then as for the soundtrack, what interests me, I guess, about the soundtrack, of course, is it uses a lot of 60s and 70s music. And this goes back to how the counterculture wasn't necessarily that counterculture. You hear a lot of songs about, changing the world. One of John Lennon's solo songs is called Working Class Hero. We mentioned Imagine, I think. But these sort of like revolutionary songs go beyond the Beatles. But I doubt that most of these musicians really did. I doubt they really lived lives that were, or I don't think they lived lives that were terribly different from those that had come before them. And the people that were listening to this music weren't necessarily like shaking up the system. They were like middle class, white people who were just kind of like, oh, this is groovy music, I like it. And then they just went on and, when it was their turn to, have power, they just did the same thing that their parents and grandparents had done. The irony with Adam Curtis is he's making a documentary about this instead of doing, something that's changing the world in a fundamental way. But of course you can make the argument that consciousness raising is the first step in that direction.
John Lennon and Yoko Ono, as they point out in the documentary, donated their hair to Michael X or to his organization. That then he basically just cashed a check and put it in his own pocket. They even kind of wanted to be radical, but even the radicals that were around didn't end up being that radical. They end up sort of failing in their mission just as well. Maybe by making this documentary, Adam Curtis is getting sucked into that same thing of art being a conservative force, that maybe Adam Curtis would instead be leading his own revolution. But maybe like if we wanted to be charitable to Adam Curtis, which we should, because we're doing a series on him, so we should be a little charitable. Maybe the point sort of
criticize him all the way down. Terrible. Adam Curtis,
down.
Cancel Adam Curtis.
Execute Adam Curtis. No, don't do that. But I guess the way I would put it is maybe that issue, maybe what he's trying to achieve is finding that vision of the future, or like maybe not even laying it out, but just sort of prompting people with maybe slightly different message from like the other radical art and radical expression, is the message underlying it is clear that like we need a new vision of the future, whatever it may be. And that's like sort of the first step. I think if there's maybe a thesis of these first couple episodes, it's that at least part of why they failed. We could look at the broader culture as a problem. We could look at their own psychology as the problem, but part of why they failed is they didn't really know what the next step was. Like, what is this thing that's beyond individualism, beyond collectivism, beyond managerialism? I don't know if he has that vision. I definitely don't. It's a very big, a tall order, but I guess it's put me onto the track of that is where we need to look. What is that? Maybe not to get too sappy, but the way that, Martin Luther King in one of his speeches says, I've seen the promised land. it's like we need to sort of like go lift our eyes over the next hillside and see what is over the next horizon.
I guess what I would say about kind of Adam Curtis's role, film forces people to confront certain things and confront them viscerally, I guess. But he, Adam Curtis is not making just a fictional. He's not turning a fictional story into a film. He's not making stuff up and then trying to say this is what this is a representation of the issues we need to change. He's actually truly making an argument, and he does have a lot of evidence to back up his point. So that I think really is actually. So earlier I was trying to figure out what was unique about documentary filmmaking, and that kind of ties that point together. It's the fact that even though it's an artistic production which is trying to represent reality as close as is possible.
You can use it to make an argument. I think that's a good point. You can use it in the same way that you could make an argument with an essay. You can do something in documentary film that you can't quite do in just a purely artistic film, that you can sort of, you can produce something that isn't just emotions. You're showing factual information as well. So I think that's a good point. It's an attempt to sort of bridge between philosophy and maybe like artistic self-expression. Maybe some people who would otherwise just sort of be digital radicals will see this and learn about have their consciousness raised.
The question I wanted to ask before we end was about Dr. King. I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts on this, because when you study the history of the civil rights movement in schools, or when I did, of course, King is represented as truly the truly revolutionary force that was speaking truth to power, to use the cliche, and was really trying to fundamentally change the world in a certain way. And then, of course, when I studied a bit more, I kind of saw that people sort of contrast Dr. King with the Malcolm X and the Black Panthers. And some people would say, well, I mean, technically, I suppose the Black Panthers and Malcolm X were more radical, but Dr. King is still he's the one with the moral high ground, because he because he rejected all violence and was kind of inspired by Gandhi in that matter. So I'm just curious, do you think so what I guess my question is, what did Dr. King represent in all of this? The documentary doesn't really talk about Dr. King much at all, but that's just a kind of a thought I wanted to explore a little bit.
Yeah, I guess to briefly answer, I think my mind goes in a couple directions with that. But so the first thing that I think I should point out is that we've kind of whitewashed Dr. King in terms of how economically radical he was. And that, like, the year he was assassinated, his big issue was a guaranteed minimum income, as he put it. He also wrote about that in his book, Chaos or Community. It was the need for a guaranteed minimum income. We know this idea now as a universal basic income, but that's just another term for it. And he insisted that it should be universal, that we have to get the poor people of all races and creeds together to fight to have a guaranteed minimum standard of income. That's an incredibly class conscious and economically leftist view of what the future should hold for the nation. And more or less, we just talk about the "I Have a Dream" speech. Everyone remembers that. That he fought against racism and injustice, things which we all recognize are bad today and were stains on the country's history. And he's celebrated for that role. But we like to ignore the kind of socialist stuff that in many ways he had views that were almost as radical economically as any of the Black Panthers had. That being said, there are the strain of people, Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, Bobby Seale, those people who, they're sort of presented as like bad and scary, and Dr. King is good and friendly. And that's the side that won out and got all the progress. And the bad and scary was, whereas, maybe there's the more left-wing view is, well, they Martin Luther King was so successful because they were scared of Malcolm X, is one of the arguments that I've heard. I think personally that that's an oversimplification. And I think both of those things together, how we kind of downplay, we kind of play up how radical Malcolm X was. We downplay how economically radical Dr. King was. And that sort of has this effect of, I don't know, it's almost like we've like mythologized Dr. King into this like Christ-like figure who died for the nation's sins. And then after Dr. King, we got over racism, just wanting to force this blueprint of Jesus on people, of the martyr, the savior, the guy who sort of absolved us and washed the sins away. When in reality, I think just like with Jesus, because if you go and you look back at Jesus, there was Apollonius of Tyana, there was, I forget all the different names, but there were all sorts of other messianic figures in the Near East at the same time, at the same place, preaching these doctrines, Gnostic-y sort of doctrines of transcendence. I think we would say, I think as significant as Dr. King was, and I'm not trying to say he wasn't significant, I think in broader history, we're going to look back at him as a wonderful, fantastic orator, but basically one of many voices that was instrumental in that movement. And that ultimately he did play that role. I wouldn't say it as simplistically as like the white people capitulated to Dr. King because they were scared of Malcolm X, but it all worked in concert. All of these different voices sort of had their role to play in, I guess I would say the unrest and the violence did have its place in moving the needle, but you did need Dr. King there to then give this more racially egalitarian vision. And again, maybe that's to go back to try and put a bow on it. Martin Luther King had a vision that the nation as a whole could see to kind of move on from like a racially based power structure. He had that vision that the whole country could buy into. Whereas maybe the reason why people look back on Malcolm X that way is they're like, well, it was like kind of black separatism in a way. It couldn't have actually moved the needle for white people. But again, without all those black power movements and the Black Panthers, I don't know if Martin Luther King would have been able to accomplish all that he did. So maybe that was my more long-winded answer than I intended. But those are
I wonder sometimes. So actually, if you look at Malcolm X's biography, it's kind of interesting because I think it was after he made the pilgrimage to Mecca, because he converted to Islam in prison. He actually came he was beginning to get closer to the Dr. King approach. Maybe Malcolm X was becoming less revolutionary and Dr. King was actually becoming more revolutionary. But of course they were, both of them were assassinated. So you never actually got to see the progression of their ideas. I agree with you. They both had a role to play.
Just speaking of their trajectory too, and the projection of it, it's like, then we have this other figure in the documentary, Michael X. He's almost sort of like the tragic version of like what Malcolm X or Dr. King could have become, and that he just falls back into this world of basically just being a gangster, which Malcolm X similarly came from a background similar to that. I haven't read a documentary or a biography of him. I've seen the Spike Lee very, very long epic biopic on Malcolm X, but detailing how he ended up in the incarceration system and all that. And so it's like Michael X kind of had a similar background, but rather than it's almost even sadder to me what happened to him than the figures of like Malcolm X and Dr. King. Not that getting assassinated is like an easy fate to have, but it's like, not only does he die in the end, but his legacy is like destroyed. And like, I actually saw a film. There's a film that came out in 2008 called The Bank Job. It's possibly the most generic film name. It's got like the most generic cover art for the DVD or like the poster. It's a Jason Statham movie called The Bank Job. So it's like, that could be anything, it's like, but the movie is based on some rough historical figures. And Michael X is a character in that movie. And he's like the bad guy. And this came out in 2008. And so I can't help but think of like how that idea still in people's heads decades later, very similar to the kinds of things that Adam Curtis talks about in this documentary, colored British society, where they're still in that 1950s mindset, the way they look at Michael X, as he's actually a very gray figure. He's a very complicated character. But like, I think of how they were talking about Peter Rackman, the guy who took him under his wing, where the British news anchor says, well, my first impression of him was just how evil he was. It's like great description. It's like not moralizing at all there, buddy. But yeah, so I don't know. I see it as it's very tragic that it's like, not only did he die and sort of fail, but he morally tarnished himself as well. And like he couldn't escape. He couldn't become that savior figure.
You know, the cliche among historians who study the French Revolution, you know, about the revolution eating their own children. So it's like, you know, the idea that like Maximilien Robespierre was responsible for the Reign of Terror, and then he himself became a victim of the Reign of Terror. I find it tragic, you know, personally for Malcolm X, but it's also tragic in the sense that he started out as wanting to be revolutionary, and then, as you said, ultimately just succumbed to I guess both his own flaws and the ideas that had been taught by the old power structure that was still hanging on. I hope to learn more about Michael X, excuse me. I hope to learn more about Michael X as time goes on. So I'm reminded, I think I'll send you this video after we stop recording, but I don't know if you're familiar with the show Uncommon Knowledge. It's run by the Hoover Institute, hosted by Peter Robinson, the speechwriter for, was it Reagan? I forget. Or so he was a speechwriter for some famous Republican president. And he runs this conservative talk show where he generally interviews conservatives. But for some reason, the one person who I guess you could say wasn't necessarily a traditional conservative that he had on multiple times was Christopher Hitchens. The episode I'm thinking about was an episode about the 60s, and it was a conversation between, or it was Peter Robinson interviewing Christopher Hitchens and William F. Buckley at the same time, both talking about the 60s, what their impressions of the time, whether they thought it was a good or bad thing, and their thoughts on the aftermath of it. And it's quite interesting, of course, because I'm kind of a big fan of Christopher Hitchens' work. That's why I bring him up fairly frequently, even if I disagree with him on many. He was a member of the International Socialists. He was a Trotskyist. I suppose when he was a young man, he would have considered himself a revolutionary. But then, you know, as time went on, he became a neoconservative, basically. I mean, he would resent me for saying that, but I think that's basically what he became. But in this episode of Uncommon Knowledge, he basically does say, well, I don't fully renounce my past. I don't fully renounce the 60s, but, you know, I guess we kind of have to say that, well, the 60s was basically a failure, or at least it was a failure in many ways. And, you know, it was kind of, he brings up some quote he saw sprawled on some brick wall in Paris, where it said, what was it? Take your desires as reality or something. So Hitchens basically ends up by saying, well, the 60s, if you had to boil down the 60s, it was kind of a release of a hedonistic utopianism.
Yeah.
And of course, I suppose if he came to that conclusion, that kind of explains his trajectory and kind of explains what he embraced the United States government and its war against terror around the world. But what I'm trying to say is, and I think this documentary is getting to that point, I think we can avoid Hitchens' error. He might have been too critical of himself and too critical of the 60s. You don't have to, you don't necessarily have to think of the 60s again as a total failure. You don't necessarily have to embrace neoconservatism. I think I understand why he might have made that mistake. I understand the thought process. I like to think there's another thought process you can go down, which is to understand if the 60s were a failure, why they were a failure, preserve maybe the better aspects of the 60s or the better aspects of the counterculture in order to take the counterculture to its logical conclusion, maybe 50 years or so later after the fact. Those are really, I guess, my final thoughts.
Yeah, I guess to just go back to the whole historical materialism idea. I mean, you could say that the 60s counterculture, it didn't deliver on, it wasn't what we thought it was. I say we, I wasn't alive, neither were you, but it wasn't we as a society thought it was when it was happening, right? That was not the big revolution, but it did contain the seed of a lot of the ideas that I think, like you said, we're living kind of in the 60s again now. We see them pop up again and again. Is that to the good or not? We've talked a lot about various revolutions that are both covered in and beyond the scope of the documentary, but it's all kind of about that revolutionary spirit. And I remember a quote that I heard, I think it was actually on Crash Course History with John Green, but where he was quoting Mao, asked about the French Revolution, whether or not Chairman Mao thought the French Revolution was ultimately a good or a bad thing. And his response that has always stuck with me is, it's too soon to say. Which, Mao.
I don't think that was actually Mao. I think that was another. I think that was someone after Mao.
Okay.
I forget the name of. It was some Chinese president or Chinese politician or something. But I do remember when he says that quote. Yes.
Right. Which to me, that's an amazing thing to say in the 20th century, but it's completely correct, because you could say that the Maoist revolution was also a product of that. And it was really too soon to say where it was going and how things were going. So I guess what I'm kind of maybe the way I would conclude, because these first two episodes do talk a lot about the 60s, the revolution, the sort of the death of collectivism and like full ascendance of individualism. And now we kind of feel like we're in that same kind of territory again, where there's a lot of like cultural sort of conflict and radicalism bubbling up through the culture. But at the same time, we're still trapped in this individualism. We don't know how to get out of it. I think we won't really know whether those ideas of the 60s of the counterculture actually will actually cash that check. It's too soon to say now. I guess I would punt that question on the same thing that it's kind of the future will determine the way we look at the past, I think, which is the strange thing about history, is that the future changes the past. As much as the past is what creates the future causes us to look back and completely reevaluate what we thought. And so that's one of the things I like about the series.
As everyone always, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No,
I just wanted to add the quote. I mean, this is a quote that if you know anything about philosophy, you've heard this quote a million times, but I bring it up a lot just because it's both an important quote and it makes me sound smart and intelligent to quote dead philosophers. But Kierkegaard says, life is lived forwards and understood backwards. You could say the same thing about history. We're going to live through, you and I, a good portion of the 21st century, but it might not be till, long after we're dead that people actually understand what we're going through right now.
Right.
And we could say the same thing about, the 20th and say 19th and even 18th centuries. We're understanding them in a different way after a certain amount of time has passed, and you can get a bit more perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I like about the documentary, is that even, especially as we go further and further, as each episode will take us a little bit closer to the present day, even events that happened very recently and that I lived through, when you examine them like kind of in a different way, or like you look at these same themes, things kind of became apparent to me that I hadn't maybe really thought of. And so even times in very recent history, it's not, even when you're living through it, it's not obvious. You have to always look backward. You always have to it's not until later when you really go, those aha moments of like, oh, that was actually a really significant event. That's what shifted all this, And so things like, for example, that I'd never really heard of, the first time that the German police agency uses the gathering of data as part of a surveillance system to catch terrorism back in, 1960, whatever the exact date was in the 60s. At the time, he's just trying to catch terrorists. He's just trying to catch this revolutionary movement. But what that like opened Pandora's box, so to speak. And now we're living with the consequences of that. And that may have seemed at the time like, oh, this is not really that significant compared to like what had just happened a couple decades before World War II, but in fact, it was incredibly significant. And that's, So I guess we'll end it there. I think we've been going for a very long time. I guess to just give a last word, I don't know if you want to plug anything. I will just say we'll be back. I don't know exactly when we'll record all this, but I'll probably release these weekly. And we'll be back to talk about episodes 3 and 4. Money changes everything, and what if the people are stupid, which sort of covers the next transition of the movement of history. So I'm very excited for that. Matt, thank you for doing this with me. If you have any plugs, take it out.
Of course. Well, thank you for having me on. Thank you for letting me participate in this little series. If anyone listening is interested in learning more about kind of my thoughts on various issues, you can either look at a podcast I co-host, Beyond Talking Points. Just put that into YouTube. And then my own YouTube channel, The Anti-Philosopher. Keegan said he likes that name. I'm not very I mean, at the time when I've created the YouTube channel, I like that name. I'm not particularly fond of the name anymore, but I can't really think of of any other name. So unless I think of a better one. Unless I think of a better name, The Anti-Philosopher is what I'm stuck with.
You're stuck with it. There's a sense of paralysis. Matt does not know how to move on from the old name that he took. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day, good night, good evening. Goodbye.